everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all. And to echo what Camille said, we've only had one panel, and my mind is already being blown with the conversations. I can't stop looking at what Ross is doing. I find myself walking by Ross several times. But I'm so excited to be in conversation with two amazing leaders in this space. To a little backstory, so we had a call together in January, I think January of this year, and we said, hey, we should do a gathering, and we said, okay, how is it gonna work? And then they didn't hear from me for 3 months, and I said, all right, y'all, we're gonna do it, and we're here today. And so I want to start with the power of just like getting started, having that conversation, really taking that leap of faith is the reason we're all here today. And I'm blessed to be able to lead this work. And so I just want to say thank you for everyone in this room who has been willing to have a conversation with me and listen to a crazy idea, because it really makes a difference. We're here today during this hour to talk about telling the truth. And we thought this was very relevant because America has a problem telling the truth. As my mother and grandmother would say, don't make a liar out of me. And constantly what I find myself as a former teacher, as a community organizer, as a budding historian and anthropologist, I find myself finding these complexities and these discrepancies in what I'm seeing versus what I'm reading and what I was actually taught. And so today with me, I have two experts in this space, and I'm excited. I'm not going to read their bios either because you will learn very quickly as they're the experts, but I'm proud to introduce Camille Westmont, who is an amazing archaeologist and historian, and does a lot of work in both Tennessee as well around history and archaeology and integrating that into social movements. And then we have Tatiana, Devia, am I saying that correctly?
You're saying it right.
Thank you. Who is a legal expert and human rights attorney and has been engaged in this work for much longer than I, but also been helping like how we tell the truth in different spaces as we think around institutions and also in the global landscape of truth-telling. How are other communities involved in this process of telling the truth? I'm honored to introduce them, and I'm honored, and if you could all welcome them as we have this conversation. Thank you all so much for joining me. And to begin our conversation, I will pass it to you, Dr. Camille, to get us started.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction and for everyone here today. So I wanted to start with just an overview of archaeology. So I am an archaeologist, I'm a historic preservationist, and I use those skills really to investigate convict leasing. Right now I'm working in Tennessee, but hoping to geographically expand in the next few years. So what does truth-telling through archaeology look like? All right, so when you think of archaeology, right, you might imagine some people maybe on the ground, they've got brushes or they've got shovels, but archaeology is so much more than that. Right, it's scientific in the sense that it's driven by research questions. It's driven by a desire to know something about the past. And this framework is a really excellent opportunity for community collaboration, community engagement, and truth-telling. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what community engagement looks like in the type of archaeology that I do. So I am a public archaeologist in the sense that I work with archaeology anywhere where it meets the public. So sometimes that's public excavations, but sometimes that's, video games where you have archaeological concepts being brought to a public audience. So in this work around convict leasing, I've been working at the Lone Rock Stockade in Tracy City, Tennessee. So the Lone Rock Stockade was the largest convict leasing prison in the state of Tennessee. It was owned, built, and operated by the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. It was in force or in use for about 12 years, and its downfall ultimately was because communities rose up and fought back, and they actually burned down the stockade as part of a broader rebellion against convict leasing in Tennessee in the 1890s. But to give a little bit of context to that, I want to talk about archaeology as a process. So where can communities be involved in this research? And they can really be involved throughout the process. So not just in the dissemination aspect, right? I don't want to be that talking head who tells someone what their history is. I want the community to join me in this process of discovering that history. And so that means involving community members with data acquisition, and really even before data acquisition, in designing the research questions, in shaping the directions that we take when we approach a site like the Lone Rock Stockade or other sites related to forced labor and unjust incarceration. And so data acquisition, again, it can be excavations. That's a form of data acquisition for archaeologists. But it can also be recording oral histories. It can be getting out into the community, looking at community archives. There's an incredible amount of information and history that's sitting in attics, in basements, and under beds. And I know I'm speaking to many historians in this room who this is old news to them. But those resources are areas that we can really work with communities to make these resources available, and not just make them available, but work with individuals on preservation and conservation. You know, what's the best way to steward these images or these documents or these diaries for another 100 years? And then another aspect of this work with the Lone Rock Stockade has been transcriptions. So the state of Tennessee the state archive has preserved a large number of the actual prison ledgers from this privately owned and privately operated prison. And so during COVID, when people were encouraged to be at home, but they were getting a little bored or stir crazy sitting in houses, myself and some colleagues at then the University of the South instigated an online transcribe-a-thon. So we used a free platform with From the Page to make images of these documents available and enable people to participate in history and in data acquisition by typing out the names of the individuals who were held at Lone Rock. And that process in itself was incredibly eye-opening. And during one of our transcribe-a-thons, a volunteer through the Nashville chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society mentioned the fact that this is probably the first time that anyone has said these names or thought about these individual people as individuals who experienced this absolutely horrific system. This is probably the first time this has happened in quite a while, possibly generations, possibly since the prison closed in 1896. And so those types of moments when you're having a conversation with a community member, with a descendant, a group, and the opportunities to humanize the past are really why I do this. Moving on to interpretation, right? Again, I have degrees in this, but the community is a central part of this work. And so community co-creation of interpretations of this evidence that we're excavating, or community-informed interpretations. And then finally, working towards dissemination, which is what types of dissemination are most useful for communities? What types of products do communities want to see for their history, for their ancestors? Are all aspects where community involvement can be woven into archaeology, and you don't need a degree to do any of this. I really see my job as a facilitator, to use the skill sets that I have to enable communities to get the answers and the evidence and pursue their own goals and their own interests. So next slide. And so what does this look like? Again, it's research into community archives. This incredible image of an African-American coal miner came out of, again, someone's basement in Tracy City, Tennessee. It's transcribing prison ledgers. It's bringing descendants to these sites and interpreting this site that didn't have any kind of marker or memorialization or even signage until about 18 months ago. And then also, finally, of course, public excavations and public archaeology days. So when I talk about archaeology, I'm talking about a lot of things, not just, stuff in a box.
What I'm hearing, and I love thank you so much. What I'm hearing is like people can participate in the truth-telling process, but now can they participate? They can help frame it. I heard you say they can actually create the questions we need to ask, which I know is the beginning of the research process. I love that, so thank you for lifting that up. That's just amazing. And Tatiana, would love for you to share about your work and your experience.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, thank you so much. This is such an amazing space. And I've been in the field of transitional justice for over a decade now. I actually started before going to law school and becoming an attorney. I started as a forensic anthropologist, and I was looking at transitional justice from a lens of forensic anthropology and looking at issues that dealt with the disappear, with extrajudicial executions, very difficult issues. And later on, gender and sexual-based violence in conflict. That's something that I worked on as well. And for the last few years, I've been working on looking at the role of the private sector in context of armed conflict, context of mass violence and repression. And this has been, again, such a missing link. So for the last few years, I've been obsessed with working in this part of transitional justice work that kind of has been ignored for a while. But when it comes to truth-telling, kind of like a global perspective, I'll start with that and then narrow it down to Colombia, which is where I've done most of my work in the US, and of course the role of the private sector. But from a global perspective with truth-telling, my experience has been through transitional justice. So usually truth-telling takes place in the form of structured frameworks of transitional justice that includes justice, truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. That's usually the model. And so this truth-seeking, truth-telling exercise usually occurs in the form of truth commissions. Could also happen as public inquiries or as historical reviews that involve collecting evidence, collecting testimonies from people. That can happen at an individual level. It can also happen at a group, at a more community-based, collective way. And then that usually goes into a report. That's typically how it's done. It involves investigations. It involves comparing and contrasting information. It involves spaces where some people from the same community come together, where different communities come together to the space, and those testimonies are collected, those investigations are done, and those reports are put together. Now, these reports are kind of the key aspect of truth-telling, and I say this because they're either the foundation for the entire transitional justice system that develops, but sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes, unfortunately, they get buried, ignored. They don't have the transformative outcome that initially was conceived in the transitional justice framework, but civil society and communities transform it into something else, right? They look at it, they grab it, they use it for advocacy, and later on even for legal cases. So I mentioned that because this is an extremely powerful tool. But what has been more powerful is the process itself, and I see it that way. Whatever the outcome is of the final report is the process that usually generates the better outcomes, I want to say, in most cases. So I'll give you a few international examples. I think the South Africa example is one of the most well-recognized examples in the world. The Truth Commission there was set up to deal with the atrocities that were committed during apartheid. It kind of created this model for other future truth commissions that later on came about. We see Liberia also had a transitional justice framework where what Truth Commission was established, and a report was published. And I think in this example, something that I saw that was very powerful is the role of women, the role that women played in storytelling, in contributing to this practice of truth-seeking and truth-telling that was just developing in the transitional justice field. That was extremely powerful, and I think that has been modeled after the Liberia example. We moved to Latin America, where I have done most of my work. We see Argentina, for example, also had a transitional justice mechanism with a truth commission. This one was more of a national commission on the disappearance of persons, and that was something that was done after the military dictatorship. This is a very interesting report that came about. It's called the Nunca Más, or Never Again. It's very well known in the field, but I think something that happened there is that the role that civil society played, because this is a time where the government was not really pushing or kind of protecting the spirit of the transitional justice system. But it was civil society who really moved it forward. Again, I think women were a key factor here. There was the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, the moms of the disappeared that had their white scarves and would go to the Plaza de Mayo, this plaza at the center, at the downtown of Buenos Aires. They would walk kind of as a silent protest and talk about memory, talk about their sons who disappeared during the military dictatorship. They moved this process forward quite a bit. Today, Argentina has one of the best forensic anthropology teams in the world. We learned a lot from them. This movement of Madres de la Plaza de Mayo is actually now like the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and more joined them in this pursuit of truth and, of course, justice and accountability. We have a similar example coming from Brazil, where also a truth commission was set up. In some of these frameworks, unfortunately, what we do see is that many of the truth commissions have one of the outcomes is recommendations. And that has been a huge criticism of transitional justice in general and outcomes of truth commissions. And it is the recommendations are usually not followed up on. It's sort of a tragedy for the field of transitional justice, but at the same time, it has been such a practical exercise to see civil society take that on and say, okay, this is what we can do about it. And sometimes that takes time. Also, there is a political issue, right? Is the government supportive or not supportive? And that has been a part of the conversation. I've done most of my work in Colombia. I am Colombian. I think when I think about this space and the things that we don't know and the things that we know, it makes me think about my own story. I came to the US over 20 years ago, and I do know that my family left as a consequence of armed conflict back in 2001 and economical issues, but I didn't really know the story. Maybe if I didn't go into transitional justice and forensic anthropology, I would have never known to this day exactly what happened. But I ended up in this field. I did forensic anthropology for a while and went back to my roots, went to Colombia, investigated the issues, and learned my own story. But I didn't know that until over a decade after I left Colombia. So something, of course, my land kind of, was attracted to it, ended up doing most of my work there. And what I was able to do there was also observe, right? It's a very complex scenario. 2 transitional justice systems have been enacted in the last couple of decades. We have the National Center for Historic Memory that created a series of reports. And lately, the most recent development was the outcome of the 2016 peace accords between the guerrillas, known as the FARC and the Colombian government. That created one of the most sophisticated transitional justice systems in the world. It's known as kind of a third generation transitional justice system. And of course, it has a truth commission with it that published a report in 2022, the summer of 2022. Now, caveat there is that there's beginning to be that sort of uncomfortable conversation of, well, but we're not following up on the recommendations yet again. However, the process itself, and when we talk about truth-seeking and truth-telling, I see it as this powerful, empowering process. And that's where we saw this play out in Colombia. I was part of some of this conversation, these sacred spaces where people, communities, different groups of people came together to uncover their history, to talk about what happened, very, very painful history. And they did this with a very sensitive methodology, with trauma-informed lawyering, with acompañamiento or psychosocial support. They did this in spaces that were considered sacred. People came together from farming communities for the first time, meeting in the same space with Black communities from our Caribbean regions. And they were basically victims of the same perpetrator, but they never talked about their overlapping histories, and that had never been put together. I think the Colombian Truth Commission did a wonderful work there, and that is kind of still under development. And now, for the last few years, I've been looking at the role of the private sector. Again, this has been kind of a missing piece of transitional justice. I think there's this very important question of who participated in the financing of violence, of war. War and violence, it's still a pretty pricey endeavor. And also the question of who benefited from it, whether directly or indirectly, who benefited from it. There is that question that really has not been dealt with. And we're seeing more of that conversation on the table. I think that is extremely relevant for Colombia, but also everywhere else. And I think those uncomfortable truths that were not dealt with, let's say in the initial periods of the Truth Commission or through the Truth Commission final report, they're coming up. They're coming up quite a bit and more often. I'll give you an example of Brazil. Truth Commission report had very powerful information about what happened to union workers in companies in places owned by Volkswagen, the German company and its Brazilian subsidiary. And this led to a big civil society movement that pushed the prosecutor's office to investigate the case. Ultimately, what happened in 2020 is that Volkswagen signed a settlement with the government, but it was a very interesting settlement because at the end there was collaboration between the companies, some sort of acknowledgement, going back to the Truth Commission's report, but also push from civil society. The Bar Association was also involved, and they did not only come up with economic compensation, but also with spaces for acknowledging the history, for spaces to build memory. They call it a memory project that also includes a museum, for example, to focus on the struggles for justice of workers in Brazil. And that's all kind of coming now into the conversation. Okay, what can we learn? How can we do this better? Because it took so many years from that Truth Commission report until now to get to this moment. But again, it was civil society driven, and that has been extremely powerful to see. Part of that settlement also includes some sort of not compensation, but financial aid for universities and for archaeology and for NCCHR teams so that they can continue doing their work. And so we're seeing more and more of this. Colombia is also a great example. I was recently in West Palm Beach, Florida, at the trial against Chiquita Banana, multinational Chiquita. I think like probably most of us here know what Chiquita Banana is. They finance terror, they finance the war in Colombia, and it took a very long time to finally get to this courtroom and get to this point where there was some justice, where the jury said, yes, you're guilty of financing paramilitaries in Colombia, and yes, you owe a compensation of $38 million to these victims. It's historic. Something that I saw in the courtroom is that a lot of the evidence and a lot of the case was built upon many of the evidence that came from Colombia through the Truth Commission, through truth-seeking, truth-telling, documentation processes. And that was another example of just seeing how powerful this exercise, this practice, this sacred spaces are.
I love that. We could spend another 3 hours unpacking
Very
that.
well.
The thing I want to lift up quickly is like I'm hearing from you, there's an actual process to telling the truth. Like it's rooted in, we say truth telling, but there's a framework, there's a way that communities can actually create a process to tell the truth. And it also sounds organic, like communities are coming together to identify, okay, this is what's happening to us, this is what's happening to y'all as well. I love that. I want to dive back into that in a minute. For Dr. Camille, I want to ask you a question specifically. Can you share an example or a time, you work with physical spaces-ish, also digital spaces, in truth-telling, but what is kind of a moment where you had in your work in which truth-telling actually had an impact on it, the physical site, or the idea of kind of how you would engage or your team would engage? What was that kind of moment for you or example?
Yeah, so the moment that will always stick in my mind was actually in that image. It was the Reverend Jerry Whedon, who is a descendant of an individual who was was incarcerated at the Lone Rock Stockade, and through the work of Margie Mason and Robin McDowell with the Associated Press, they were able to track down a descendant, track down him and his family, and actually bring them from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, down to Tracy City to visit this site and see where I think it was their great-great-great-grandfather was held, and a place that he ultimately survived and was able to leave and go on to live his life and have a family. But that moment where the Reverend, he just felt this urge to walk up to the coke ovens where predominantly African American prisoners were forced to work because it was identified as the worst job within this prison complex. And he just put his hand on the roof of the coke oven and just stood there for a couple minutes, and he didn't say anything, and we all just kind of stood back and watched, and he was praying. And it was that moment of just like, again, humanizing the past, humanizing these people, recognizing that again, history happens somewhere, and I loved that line in the documentary, and I jotted it down, that all history happens somewhere, and that when you can bring people back to these places and begin that process of reintegrating these stories into kind of the public consciousness, what that can do for people today. It's not just a testimony to the survivors of the past, and a testimony to the people who did not survive convict leasing and who were killed by this system. But it's also a testament to their descendants and to the communities that have persevered in spite of really intense oppression. So that moment will always be one in my mind. But again, looking at the transformative potential. So one of the things that I'm most proud of in this work is that what started as kind of a one-year archaeology project has turned into a completely transformative initiative. And it went from literally, I got a call in January of 2021 that said the state of Tennessee is trying to give this site to the city of Tracy City. And Tracy City it's in Grundy County. Grundy County is the poorest county in the state of Tennessee. They just don't have the resources to protect or preserve or steward a site with this much historical value. And the state was trying to give it away, to get it out of the park system. And I just learned a week ago that the state of Tennessee has completely made a 180 and that they are now going to turn this little part of the South Cumberland State Park into its own state park. So this history, that community engagement, people lobbying, legislatures in the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville have themselves, they've made this site into, a place that is going to be memorialized, that is going to be remembered, that hopefully we can have some kind of future visitors center and interpretation and center for descendants to come and be in this place and be reconnected with that history that was, partially erased or mostly erased for 100 years.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's exciting. When you mentioned earlier, I was excited because we're under a similar work in Atlanta, and so excited that these sites can be in connection. Tatiana, I'm excited to when you mentioned talking about our corporate space, and that's an interesting word to use, and I'm really interested because of Atlanta specifically is a business city. Mm-hmm. It's a city that was built on business. If you saw it in the documentary, you've all heard of the name Grady, right? You can't walk anywhere in the city without hearing about Grady Hospital. People call themselves Grady babies, right? They were born there, right? But there's these historic business names here, and we begin to have conversations to understand like the history of these people and these sites and these names, right? These streets, you got the Woodruff or Candler, right? These people have these connections. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this corporate responsibility in truth-telling. How does that happen? Can it happen? And how can folks engage with that, right? When some of these, it came out, I think AP did a piece earlier this year talking around fast food companies that are directly connected to forced labor today, as in 2024. So we're still having conversation around corporate responsibility. What are you seeing in this space, and how can folks engage with that? What should folks be doing?
This is, again, I said this earlier, it was the missing link in transitional justice. And I think it wasn't an accident or simply ignored. I think there is such powerful forces behind making it the missing link, making sure that it is ignored, that there is no reckoning or accountability. It is a very challenging question. And I saw it play out in Colombia live when the peace accords, in its official document, they decided that they were going to look at that. They were going to look at the responsibility of economic actors in the Colombian conflict and within the transitional justice context. And there were very powerful forces, including some parts of the government sector, and of course the private sector, that sometimes, we know, they go hand in hand, to erase it from this piece of legislation. And they were successful at doing it. They took it to the Constitutional Court, and the court decided that the transitional justice framework was not authorized to deal with that. So then, again, civil society, in part, we had a big push also from the transitional justice mechanisms themselves to not let that happen and to still make that conversation happen. So in the process of truth seeking and truth telling, they were spaces that were created so that the business sector, the private sector could come also to the table and engage in these conversations. But also, they did it because there is this push from unions, again, from civil society, from the communities where they operate, to say, you need to sit down and be part of this, because they avoided it during the first transitional justice process. I think there was also a lot happening at the time in sort of the international environment, the international context, that kind of pushed them to sit down and have the difficult conversation. it's a very imperfect field. I wish I had a very specific example of this model worked, but I think it's just a push, and it's so context specific that it is just important to sit down and sort of think, okay, what are the expectations? What are the potential outcomes? And make that push towards having the conversation and having a conversation with the business sector. But I think now more and more we're seeing that this is not going to be eternally ignored, and this uncomfortable part of history and who benefited from conflict and the question of land. A lot of it has to do with land dispossession, with ownership of land. Is not being erased as they thought. If anything, I think what these conversations and truth-seeking and truth-telling have done is bring in new generations to sit at the table and think about, what happened? How does, let's say, this big corporation owns this big piece of land or has so much power over this number of workers, and they're doing fantastic work. Students are doing amazing work at mobilizing, at boycotting, at, again, just making this a more public issue. And I think it is right then when the business sector at some point says, okay, we're gonna have to sit down and have the conversation. But it's not easy, and it's extremely context specific.
That's true, and I really feel like that is the place where I know we want to engage more, is like having conversations with, where we talk around perpetuators, right? I think I said that right. But also like thinking that beyond individual, right, what does that look like for an actual institution, right? How can we engage them directly? So I love that. So now we want to open it up to some of our Q&A. And so if you have a question, I think we have time for two. So if anyone has a question, we see one in the back. Kama.
I actually don't have a question.
Okay.
But I have an assignment, and then I'll let the questions, because listening to your two stories from other parts, a different country, a different state, we were thinking back here that we would love to capture, so you're going to get cards given out to you at the end of this, of some of these untold stories in your area. And we would like to capture, some of these stories, and if you could put, whether it's going to be something with farming, Black farmers in your community, like something that's like bubbling in your community now, and put it down for us and what state or what county you're in. We're going to compile all that and share it back out to you all. So just adding that to the conversation.
Yeah. No, love that came up, because I mean, as I sit here, since you mentioned the mothers of the disappeared, I've been like thinking about that and understanding and just wanting to know more about that group and how they are telling and amplifying their story and their truth. I love that. But wanted to open up to any questions for this group around anything. Yes.
I'm a Georgia State student, working with Doug Blackman on the Truth and Transformations Initiative. I had a question about how you as a lawyer, you're humanizing people and creating a space where we look at victims as not only people who have suffered, but also who deserve justice. And same thing for Dr. Westmont, you're looking at archives and the stories behind that. How do you think, how would you use the stories that you find to engage with the public or with propaganda? To both of you.
Sure, I can start. That's a very important question and a very important issue, and I think a lot about, again, my work in Colombia and the people. And I think something that has been extremely powerful and important to see is not victims, this is the language we have as victims, but people who survive and thrive and are resilient. I've learned more, I think, from being in these scenarios than what I think I have brought to the table. What I've done is take that and make it into something else, whether it is through a report, through, of course, building a legal case and creating advocacy around it. Instead, in these spaces, what communities have done is create this transformative space for restoration. And I love to talk about restorative justice because I see this as spaces where That's the beauty of truth seeking and truth telling, of sitting down, talking about these difficult issues, but then seeing the people, the survivors with resilience actually take the driver's seat and say, okay, what's next, right? And then your perception completely changes there. You sort of go to the back and you just want to observe and be given whatever it is that they want to give you, however they want to transform their current reality, and that's what you do. But I think part of it has been seeing this process of restorative justice, of collectiveness, of community building, and changing this perception of not just victims of conflict or private sector abuse and injustice, but survivors that in the midst of sometimes very horrible circumstances have managed to create beautiful futures. And now the question also becomes how do you transform this for future generations. I think there is also a question of the future generations, children, young people who now are growing up in the middle of this context. I'm a mom, so I think about my own daughter and what are the stories that I want to pass on, and how do I want her to perceive the present and the current society that we're in. So as an attorney, I think that working with the communities and understanding where they're coming from and why they want to pursue a specific legal strategy versus another has been kind of the key ingredient there.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Tatiana. I'm just kind of confused. My name is Michael Orwitz. I'm from the University of Connecticut, the Art and Human Rights sector of the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut. Anyway, the question I have is, I'm confused as to what legal structure, juridical structure you're talking about when you're talking about people bringing cases or having, wanting to try corporations. My understanding of the lei de víctimas, the victims' rights, the law of victims of 2011, was that certain cases could go through the Constitutional Court, but after that, that was it. If the Constitutional Court decided they're not going to deal with this, you had to go to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And so I was just wondering, do people have, what kind of access do people have at the village, grassroots, community level to have access to those kinds of courts and those kinds of processes, which last years and years and years, and how much patience it takes and, courage and stuff. I'm just wondering just how this plays out. If you could answer any of that. Thank you.
And you're talking about just like, for example, the Colombia scenario, right? Okay. Some of these cases do take place in Colombia, and they're very difficult to develop. But there are a few examples. They usually involve civil litigation. Some of these cases are actually moving forward. Call them legal cases, but they're not precisely litigation. They're just within the transitional justice system where they're building cases within the tribunal. And a lot of this, of course, is backed up by what the Truth Commission has already published. Now, some other cases where, let's say, corporate actors are foreign companies are being developed in foreign courts. So a lot of European courts have received some of these cases. Many of them have been dismissed. Some of them are moving forward. Let's say in the US, we have multiple US-based companies that have participated in atrocities in Colombia. I can talk specifically about the Chiquita case, for example, but also the Drummond case in Alabama. Communities in Colombia decided that they want to litigate the case in Alabama, and those cases are still moving through the system, and it's been, unfortunately, about a decade. So yes, it's a lengthy process that sometimes is not sustainable, that sometimes does not have a specific outcome, but I think it's precisely, part of the process itself what makes this still a powerful strategy when it can be developed, whatever the outcome is. And it is in the process of this, you're still building the narrative, you're, as a community, still creating advocacy strategies. You're still moving the conversation forward, and most importantly, you're still seeking accountability. So there is still the chance that some of these cases will be successful, and if they're not, then communities have been extremely creative at making something out of it and taking it to a different scenario.
See, no, you don't have to apologize.
Dr. Westmont, when you were talking about the research questions that you get from communities, what would you say was the most interesting? The most interesting research question you've received from a community?
Yeah, I guess maybe the one that sticks in my mind the most, and the one that I found most powerful, and also interesting in that, right, was that people wanted to know very strongly where the individuals who were incarcerated at Lone Rock and died, where their remains are. And of course, that is a question that archaeology can answer. And unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as some of the TV shows make it out to be. And so it's a research question that I am still actively pursuing in using different types of technologies to try and uncover this cemetery that we know has at least 300 people, probably closer to 500 people interred in it. That's somewhere in the hills of Grundy County, Tennessee. And finding that, and then thinking about memorialization and bringing descendants back to this place where these people have been lost is definitely the research question that keeps me up at night, but that I have a lot of faith that one day we'll find it.
And I'm going to ask a final question for you, and it's really, why does telling the truth matter? Jill mentioned earlier, we got a lot of questions. Y'all saw the 1906 documentary, and after some of the work we did, there was a New York Times piece that came out about Atlanta and the race massacre, and I made a mistake that they tell you to never do. They tell you never read the comments, and I read the comments. And there was so much, and this was folks all across the country. Why are you doing this? Why does this matter? Can't we just move forward? And I think I don't have space and energy, but I'm really interested in moments of divisiveness. Why does it matter that we tell the truth? To a room full of truth tellers, why does it matter? And why should we continue to push for the truth, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard? Why does it matter?
Yeah, I can start. I've seen the transformative power that truth has on a family, on a union. I've seen these spaces where coming to the table together and building this history, and truth-seeking and truth-telling has this very powerful outcome, not just for them as a family, as a unit, as a group, as a community, but also for future generations. I truly believe that if you don't have a strong foundation, everything else will crumble. And I think we see this happening. That's why people, they don't forget. What has not been dealt with in past Truth Commission reports, it's coming back. It's coming back in other ways, through other avenues. It's not just going to die off and be ignored. I think it's important, if we're talking about transitional justice and we talk about reconciliation and memory, we also have to talk about prevention and guarantees of non-repetition. And if you have a strong foundation, you can build better. You can build something stronger that's going to be more sustainable and transformative. So I absolutely believe that truth is a key component of creating this foundation. Otherwise, the house will crumble.